Welcome to this lecture in which we consider the 1930s, a decade of gathering storm clouds and of dark portent for the future. It was a dark time marked by a deepening worldwide economic crisis, the failure of democracies, and what many felt was the inevitable global clash of ideologies that had superseded liberal ideas. This lecture will examine that tragic trajectory. In our previous lecture, we had discussed the radical new movement of fascism that claimed to be a part of the illiberal wave of the future. Now in the 1930s, one would see a growth of clashes as well as a realization of how this decade would force upon the entire world a choice of course. It was a time of crisis. Crisis that could be observed in many ways, in culture, in society, and ideas. The crisis in culture was summed up by the British poet W.H. Auden, who wrote about the 1930s as a decade in a poem that marked the start of World War II at the end of that dark decade, and thus the poem was entitled September 1st, 1939, that he was now, quote, uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. The low, dishonest decade was the words that he used to describe this period of sliding into misfortune. At the same time, the great Irish poet William Butler Yeats had tried likewise to feel the pulse of the times. He wrote that it was a time when things fall apart and the center does not hold, when, quote, the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. In this decade, those who might have changed the fortunes of the times seemed to lack that crucial political ingredient that we talked about from the very start of our lectures, a sense of confidence, and momentum seemed to have passed to movements opposed to liberal ideas. Those liberal ideas had been battered by the First World War, the erosion of human rights, the growth of total states, and the post-war disappointment with democratic politics, especially in Europe, but spreading worldwide as well. One could detect also crisis in society, which would lead thinkers to argue that extreme times called for extreme solutions, to argue that it was a time of choices for communism or against communism, for fascism or against fascism, a time of sorting out into different camps. The crisis in society was especially marked in economic terms. It's synonymous for us with the Great Depression that reached worldwide after 1929. It hit two countries with developed industrial economies especially hard, the United States and Germany. In the United States, the Great Depression was at its height in 1932, with a quarter of the workforce unemployed and industrial production sagging by 60%. Germany had likewise been badly hit, with 6 million unemployed in 1932, disenchantment with democracy. The consequence was that both the Nazis and the German communists would see their support grow, and many were convinced that democracy was doomed, with the only question remaining what would replace it in Germany. Paradoxically, it was precisely at this moment that ideas of imperialism would be offered up as a way of renewing the cultures in crisis, a way of, as it were, backtracking from the experience of the First World War and its global impact to revive the imperialist project. Some Europeans looked back to their recent imperialist past, hoping to reinvigorate their own cultures and politics by dominating others and once again expanding their empires. It's paradoxical, but there's probably an internal logic to it, that such demands were strongest in those nations whose colonies were few or disappointing, in the case of Italy, or had been lost or taken away as a result of defeat in the First World War in the case of Germany. Mussolini's fascists in Italy would clamor for an imperial mission in Africa, They would speak of the mystique of a civilizing mission in that continent. In Germany, the situation was particularly acute. With Germany's loss of colonies that had not been very rewarding to begin with at the close of the 19th century as a result of defeat in the First World War, the cry would go out for the respect that such colonies could afford in the future. In Germany, there arose a particular and popular pseudoscience known by the name of geopolitics. This geopolitics claimed to be scientific. It claimed to offer the keys to the existence on a healthy basis of human societies. It raised demands for what was called national autarky, a word very popular at the time, not only in Germany but worldwide, denoting the dream of, a utopian dream of total economic self-sufficiency, cutting oneself off from any reliance on the outside world. This geopolitics also foresaw a time when the world would be divided into blocks of superpowers, moving far beyond the sort of nationalism that had been important in the 19th century to racial blocks united by ethnic affiliation, and, especially in the German case, concern over what was called living space, or Lebensraum in German, the obsession for a territory of a scale into which one could expand and grow a people's population. Now, in fact, in spite of such frenetic and fevered dreaming, renewed imperialism didn't prove durable. Nationalist movements had already spread to non-Western areas under colonial control. The very spectacle during the First World War of Europeans battling Europeans in what was sometimes called Western civilization's suicide attempt or a European civil war had inspired non-Western peoples in the hope that they might gain their independence and shrug off the burden of imperialism. Their hopes had been quelled and disappointed in the Versailles Treaty and the Paris settlements that had not afforded them the respect for their national independence that some had hoped for. And indeed, it was in this period after the First World War that the growth of nationalist movements in non-Western societies would often be met with ferocious, brutal repression and imperialist punitive expeditions, now using aircraft and on occasion poison gas, which were intended to stamp out once and for all the demands of non-Western nationalists. But even such campaigns would fail to quell demands for independence. Demands for independence, moreover, that would sometimes seek to appeal to some of the ideas that had been taken aboard from Western societies, as well as homegrown notions, such as nonviolent resistance championed by Mahatma Gandhi in the Indian movement for independence. Against this background, one needs to cite early examples of ferocious violence against non-Western peoples, in part as sort of a rearguard action, I think already suggesting how such attempts were doomed to failure. The notorious Amritsar massacre in India in 1919, when British-ordered troops killed hundreds trying to quell what was seen as a nationalist event. The notion that societies faced crisis in terms of the resources available to them and their future was also summed up in what was considered at the time a science known as eugenics. Eugenics was a made-up term denoting a utopia of the good birth. That's the original meaning of the term eugenics itself. Eugenics was a term that had been invented in 1883 by a British scientist, Francis Galton, coincidentally a cousin of Darwin, whose ideas he drew upon, arguing that societies needed to take in hand the process of breeding of human beings, to no longer allow this to be a process that would unfold by accident or by whim, but to steer the process consciously. This could include positive eugenics, meaning the encouragement and subsidy of those who deserve to reproduce, according to the adherents of this set of ideas, as well as, more ominously, negative eugenics, determined to stop or forestall the reproduction, to discourage, at the very least, the reproduction of those considered to be unfit. This eugenics took on a remarkable reputation worldwide and had gained many adherents. It seemed to present modern answers to social problems by regarding them as basically biological or medical issues that could be solved or dealt with in a therapeutic scientific way. It was argued that especially at times of crisis with scarce resources, the genetic stock of a society needed to be improved by vigorous state intervention, precisely the sort of state intervention that the First World War, in times of total mobilization, had now been shown to be possible. Eugenics achieved remarkable popularity worldwide and across the political spectrum, from the left as well as the right, because of its promise of modern solutions to current problems. There were two countries in particular which leapt towards the ideas of eugenics in particularly marked ways, and they were Sweden and the United States. Eugenic policies in these nations, which often functioned as models for those of other countries, included laws for the involuntary or compulsory sterilization of the mentally ill in prisons, in mental institutions, and in psychiatric hospitals. In Sweden and in the United States, such phenomena became all too common. By 1935, in the United States itself, over 21,000 had been involuntarily sterilized. This is a fact of the historical record in the United States that is not as well known as it should be. These were measures that were presented as science at its most cutting edge in dealing with social problems. In Germany, soon after the Nazis came to power in 1933, they would pass eugenic laws and enact increasingly ambitious eugenic programs. And it's a bitter irony of the historical record that in many cases they would explain gratefully that they had drawn their inspiration and their model from the case of the United States, its eugenic movement, and in particular the racial segregation that obtained especially in America's South. What we see here is the bitter reality that the sort of ideological mass movements we were discussing in this course could draw their inspiration not only from one another, but also on occasion even from democratic regimes and movements within them. There's one particular author, the British journalist Aldous Huxley, who described these trends in a vision of what the future might look like. In 1932, he published a book, a classic of dystopian or anti-utopia, entitled Brave New World, in which he foresaw a society based on trends that he already felt were current in the 1930s, this dark decade. He explained afterwards that he was simply extrapolating trends already at work. He saw the disorder and the uncertainty of his own time and felt that it was precisely that chaos that might lead to a demand for the opposite, a society of too much order. His novel was set around the 27th century. It showed a society based on the ideas of a mythic founder who was perhaps Henry Ford, perhaps Sigmund Freud. It wasn't entirely clear. It was an ambiguity he worked into his novel, as people would speak of the founder as either our Ford, a play on our Lord, or our Freud. His original ideas were summed up in the notion that stability was the central value of a society, and even human individuality, even human nature itself, could be sacrificed to that value. This was, with a vengeance, a vision of better living through chemistry. Chemistry and what was called emotional engineering, the conditioning of human beings, as well as cloning and eugenic manipulation, were said to have solved the problem of happiness, most notoriously by providing happiness in chemical form, in so-called soma pills, which were said to explicitly have replaced religion. These soma pills, which promised instant chemically induced happiness, were on occasion referred to as Christianity or alcohol without any of the disadvantages. On another occasion, these pills were referred to as Christianity without the tears. Religion, sapped of its promises of deeper meaning, now had been replaced by chemistry. in Huxley's vision. Cloning and eugenic manipulation had produced a society not of equality, but a stable society of unequal castes, hardwired into their position in society from the dominant alphas to the epsilon drudges in society, breaking apart what earlier thinkers had considered a human nature that united us all into divided, biologically determined, unequal brands of humanity. The violence which the 1930s already brought to bear as a premonition of the greater violence of the Second World War to come, and how few the attempts were to resist that violence as it grew, were most remarkably announced in the Italian fascist invasion of Ethiopia, trying to carve out that imperial state which the fascists saw as a guarantee of their vitality and their movement's dynamism. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, or as it was then called Abyssinia, in Africa in 1935, was an important milestone of the decade, contemporaries saw in retrospect, because it showed not only the aggressiveness of the fascists, that had been clear from early on, but also revealed the weakness of collective security, international opinion, and what was called the international community as a whole. Mussolini aimed to carve out for Italy an African empire on the model of the ancient Romans, as well as to redeem the remarkable defeat by the Ethiopians of an Italian army in Ethiopia in 1896. The Italian forces didn't shy away from, indeed they celebrated and reveled in, the most remarkable use, destructive use of modern technology. The Italian army used airplanes and poison gas against the Ethiopian forces, so that even their valiant defense of their homeland was ultimately quelled. Mustard gas was showered down upon Ethiopian forces, at first with shells, and then later pumped down over them by airplane. Ethiopians were hunted like animals by airplane. Their population centers were bombed from the air in a sign of the greater bombardments from the air by aircraft yet to come. The Italians, in spite of declaring their victory by 1936, nonetheless would have to contend with resistance that followed in a heroic and determined way from the years to come. They followed what they quite deliberately called a policy of terror and of tenfold retribution in atrocities for resistance on the part of Ethiopians, who were also rounded up and put into concentration camps, as we'd seen as an earlier phenomenon of imperialist campaigns. But in 1936, the country was annexed to Italy as part of its empire. The Italian king was declared Emperor of Ethiopia, and Mussolini's own followers declared him to be not just like a god, but a new god in human form. One of the byproducts of this Italian conquest of Ethiopia, which was to redound as disaster to the fascist regime later, was that Mussolini began to believe such praise himself. But we want to stop for a moment to consider what the international reaction to this clear provocation on the part of one member of the League of Nations against another constituted. The international reaction was weak. The League of Nations certainly condemned the act in the strongest of diplomatic language, but when it came to actually putting teeth to its words, only mustered weak sanctions against Italy and was careful not to include what might have had a strategic effect, an oil embargo against that state, fearing that this was too provocative. This helpless response on the part of the League of Nations to what was clear aggression discredited that institution and led it soon to fade away. In Geneva, speaking to the League of Nations, the Ethiopian emperor had prophetic words to say. Disappointed by the weak reaction, he told the delegates, "First it was us, next it will be you." The German dictator Adolf Hitler praised Mussolini's action, and the earlier tense relations between these dictators, competing as they were to announce their own brand of the wave of the future, now began to warm. Italy and Germany became fast friends, leading to the formation of an alliance, the Rome-Berlin Axis of October 1936, a milestone on the way to the Second World War. Half the world away, one could see another phenomenon also of growing aggression in the case of what was called the Empire of the Rising Sun, Japan. Japan had resolutely modernized and had sought to beat the Western imperialist powers at their own game. It had embraced modernization, blending Western models with its own culture after the 1868 Meiji Restoration, adapting Western technology, techniques with Japanese beliefs. Japan launched imperialist expansion by going to war with China in 1894 to show that it too could be an imperialist predator in the same way as the Western powers were, and then, to the astonishment of an often racist Western world, against Russia, which defeated in 1904 and 1905. After both these wars ended in victory, Japan annexed Korea in 1910 and had carved out for itself an Asian empire. During World War I, Japan encroached further on China to make it a Japanese protectorate. Its ideology made clear the growing aggressiveness of its approach. Japanese imperialism was increasingly masking its domination of non-Japanese peoples with the slogan, Asia for the Asians, not followed through on in practice. Propaganda spread the doctrine of Japanese racial superiority and national unity under a divine emperor. And Japan continued its depredations against China to prove its vitality in the dark 1930s. In the 1931 Manchurian crisis, the Japanese military staged the Mukden incident, blowing up a railway and then blaming Chinese terrorists for the act. This sort of big lie would be a recurring phenomenon, the provocations that we'll see in next lectures. The Japanese took over the province and established a puppet state of Manchukuo. After the League of Nations once again criticized in the strongest term this occupation, the Japanese simply left the League in 1933, and their attacks continued upon China unrestrained. In 1937, fighting broke out between Chinese and Japanese forces at the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing, leading to 8 years of war and Japanese control of northern China and the coastlands. Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists, such as Mao Zedong, whom we'll discuss in a later lecture, resisted the Japanese but also fought against one another. In 1937, in a mass atrocity, when Japanese forces took the city of Nanking, the capital of the Chinese nationalist government, they massacred and brutalized civilians in what contemporaries called the Rape of Nanking. Civilians were killed by the thousands, and rape and abuse continued for weeks. The record of this atrocity still staggers the imagination. In the war that followed, the Japanese Army's Unit 731 would also use biological weapons against Chinese civilians. The event, however, that closer to home for Europeans seemed to represent a dress rehearsal for World War II was the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. In July of 1936, General Francisco Franco led a military revolt against the Spanish Republic, supported by the fascist Falange and nationalist forces. They opposed the Popular Front of Democrats, Socialists, Anarchists, and Communists who supported the Republic. The Civil War soon developed an international dimension as fascist Italy and Nazi Germany intervened with supplies and troops and airplanes in favor of Franco. For their part, pursuing the Popular Front strategy of the Comintern, the Soviet Union supplied Republican forces and international brigades of volunteers who felt they could fight fascism in Spain. At the same time, however, on the Republican side, communist forces were pursuing another agenda as well. They purged their own anarchist allies in the Popular Front, jockeying for position in a future Spain that they hoped might become a Soviet satellite, and undermined in the process, fatally, the Republican war effort. This war took some 500,000 lives. It was marked by atrocities like the April 1937 terror bombing attack on the Basque town of Guernica from the air by the German Condor Legion. This attack, which lasted for 3 hours, was considered by its victims to be very nearly a preview of the end of the world and how it would appear. It was an experiment in some sense, in how to destroy civilian populations from the air. And it would be perfected during the course of aerial bombardment in World War II. Another feature of this atrocity, the bombing of Guernica, which was later immortalized in the painting by Pablo Picasso, was also significant. The use afterwards of propaganda and the technique of the big lie on the part of General Franco to simply deny the event outright. In an event that we'll see echoed as recently as the Balkan Wars in our later lectures and ethnic cleansing in that part of the world, the victims would themselves very often be blamed. The nationalist forces under Franco created the myth that it was in fact the people of Guernica themselves who had supposedly destroyed their city. The victims would be blamed for these atrocities as a way of shedding responsibility. In his memoir, Homage to Catalonia, in 1938, British writer and also Republican volunteer fighting on the side of the Spanish Democratic Republic, George Orwell, bitterly recounted from personal experience how the communists in Spain had, at Stalin's orders, betrayed their allies. His novel, An Homage to Catalonia, would become a classic of political disenchantment. And George Orwell's particular attack against communism would later be stepped up in other novels that we'll discuss later in our lectures. General Franco had won by 1939. He established harsh authoritarian rule with killings, internment in concentration camps, and repression of the intensest sort against the opponents of the regime. In its brutality, in its identity as a clash of opposing ideological camps, in its identity as very nearly a proxy war in advance between the different ideologies abroad in the 1930s, the Spanish Civil War would appear to be, in many ways, a dress rehearsal for the next World War. That World War would perfect the techniques of total war that already had been accelerated in the course of this conflict. But there would be in particular one phenomenon that would send the world hurtling towards the Second World War, and that was to be the rise of Nazism. In 1930, the Nazi movement, the Nazi Party, which will be more fully discussed in detail in our next lecture, made a breakthrough in German elections. By the 1930s, it was already clear to acute observers of the German political scene that democracy was most likely done for. It certainly had had what appeared to be a chance to solidify itself in the course of the 1920s, a brief period of stability from 1924 to 1929. Now it seemed clear that democracy had run its course in Germany, and the only question remained: what was to follow? Some new form of dictatorship was the likeliest variant. The Nazis in 1930 made a breakthrough in German elections by promising an end to elections in the future. Their party acquired national prominence, and as the Great Depression gripped hold, they would expand their hold on power. They promised to restore order, to create unity, to bring about economic revival, and, quite clearly, to abolish democracy as it had been experienced. With that list of promises, the Nazis would come to power in a crucial Central European state in 1933. Along with the international crises of the 1930s, the slipping into violence, the increasingly frequent recourse to wars of aggression, it would in particular be the rise of Hitler and his Nazi Party that would lead to the Second World War. In our next lecture, we'll examine the rise of Nazism and the launching of its destructive course.